Yes, that is me, a traditionalist, a conservative. The established ways are the best ways. Change nothing. All right, thank you, Kurt. That is absolutely true. I cannot stress this enough. I am not an expert in security. And I have, in fact, been asking on Twitter for people to write this talk for at least a decade, and nobody did it. So I have. Well, that's not exactly true. Jez Humble wrote a version of it, which is amazing, and everyone should go watch it, but it is like 13 years old now. The kind of stuff that I usually talk about are things like this, or that, and so the theme of this talk is, can we talk about all that stuff everybody's like, oh yeah, would love to do that, absolutely agree, that's the right way to do it, but we can't. We can't because we're in Europe, or we're regulated, or a whole bunch of other excuses, reasons / excuses. Let's start with this. When I'm talking about modern software development best practices, the things that really come to mind are things like this. Engineers owning their own code in production, practicing observability-driven development, testing in production, separating your deploys from releases, making liberal use of feature flags, and ideally continuous deployment, or at least delivery, but really deployment is best. And what all of these have in common is that they're all about fast feedback loops. Really, really fast feedback loops. Getting your code into production as fast as possible after writing it, while it's all still fresh in your head. You have all that original intent. You're just brimming over with knowledge about this thing that you've done and why you did it and how you did it, and iterating on it. And yeah, fast is good, blah, 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 blah. But like, these are systems, right? And so there's two kinds of feedback loops, right? There's the amplifying ones and the dampening ones. And so many of these feedback loops in our socio-technical systems are these amplifying ones. And so if you do something, 10% better at the very top of your pipeline, it has ripple effects. It feeds back into itself. And it has, like, the effects just get amplified. It's like compound interest, but for your time. These practices are not just super trendy. I feel like there's a tendency sometimes in the security community to be like, well, that's Twitter-driven development, which it's not, honestly. This represents like just a cajillion years, people years of chipping away at these processes and tools, trying to make them better, trying to figure out how to build better software, and even more importantly, how to build better engineers. How well your team performs is really the number one thing in my experience that determines how happy you are at your job, how fast you learn, how excellent you become at this job. Ultimately, even the success or failure of your company has a lot to do with this. Now, let's go over each of these super briefly, just so we're all on the same page. I feel like we've reached the end of the DevOps movement, more or less. Like, it's kind of the split that should never have happened. Like, if you think about it, in retrospect, it was ridiculous to think that half of our engineers could write code and the other half could understand the code. Like, it never made much sense. We did it for good reasons. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but it wasn't a great idea. And so now I feel like, everyone writes code. Everyone owns it in production. That's just table stakes. You own your deploys. You should have control over when to ship your code out, when to roll it back. You should be able to see if it's doing what you expected it to do, because ultimately our systems are getting to the point of complexity where you can't just operate it as a black box. You have to participate in building it in order to be able to operate it well. And the reverse is just as true. In order to develop these systems well, you have to be exposed to the consequences of your actions. We talked about this a little bit this morning, but by observability-driven development, I just mean including production into your iterative process. Going and looking at it, instrumenting, having a sense of humility. Like, deploying your code does not mean this is done, check. It's more like putting your cookies into the oven to begin baking, to begin building confidence in this wonderful piece of code that you've written. Everyone tests in production. Only some of us admit it. Admitting it is the first step towards doing it safely and sanely, and not just by accident. Separating deploys from releases. Like, this is one of these things that I feel like doesn't get called out quite enough, because if you think about it, when it comes to software, we all know now speed is safety, right? Speed is safety. It's like, and we have this biological desire as human beings to, like, when we get nervous or scared, we like freeze up and we slow down because, it just feels safer. But it's not. It's more like ice skating or riding a bike. And if you slow down, you'll fall over. You really don't want to slow down. You want to ship more diffs more often, smaller ones. But this is very much in tension with the needs of the marketing team and the product managers and just the ability of your go-to-market team to plan a business. And the way that we fulfill both of these masters is with feature flags. And finally, continuous deployment. I really want to put a plug out here for one of the most amazing things that you can do for the health, the sanity, the high functioning of your systems is to make it so that anytime someone merges their code up to main, it automatically gets deployed to production, or at least some small segment of production. Like, it should feel almost like an atomic operation. And it should be as short as possible. Like, there's such a world of difference between, all right, I'm merging, and then I gotta deploy or wait for someone else to deploy. Changes start piling up. Now you're shipping a bunch of people's changes all at once. When you merge and you have muscle memory, like in your body that it's going to be live within 15 minutes, you're probably going to go look at it. And if you merge and you don't know when it's going out, you don't know how many other people's changes are going out with it, you're never going to go look at it. It's one of the first things I did in month 2 of Honeycomb was I got really tired of hitting deploy all the time, so I wrote this beautiful little handcrafted cron job in Bash that looked to see if there was a new artifact, and if so, unpacked and rolled it out. Best piece of code I've ever written in my life. It's still running. It's fantastic. Being able to flip that assumption from it's not going to go out to it's definitely going out, it's so healthy. All right, this concludes the portion of the talk that I am comfortable with. Now let's talk about security. Explain it to me like I'm 5. Okay, from what I understand, security is about confidentiality, integrity, availability. You must protect customer data, and you must ensure your code is safe. It's not very prescriptive about how. In security terms, we have regulations and we have frameworks. Regulations are ones that the actual fair, loose, and the specifics. Wow, I don't remember when I wrote those notes. It's okay to have protections above and beyond what your documented policies say you're doing, but it's not okay to not be doing what your documented policies say you're doing. In this talk, we are not getting anywhere near FedRAMP. No, that's somebody else's problem. Frameworks, though, are usually pretty loose on the specifics, right? None of them actually forbid any modern development best practice. However, they may conflict with your own written policies, the ones that are being used to demonstrate compliance, such as people should not be able to see private data unless you have a business need to do so. What does business need mean? That's a great question. People often end up using sort of shorthand like regulatory reasons when they actually mean their own actual policies and customer contracts. I hear this over and over and over and over. It's like, it's the law, it's the rule. Well, is it like the government's law, or is it just like shorthand for internal law? Because these are very different. We have very different, amounts of control over these things. And then there are customer contracts, and if you're reading the fine print, these often conflict with each other, like keep all logs forever and don't log anything, sometimes in the same contract. So the important part to remember here is that policies are living documents. It may not be fast and easy to fix these. It may take some time and persuasion and relationship building, but they are living documents. And it's really not, it's a bad sign when people just like walk away and they're like, well, don't want to touch that. It's actually much like software. Healthy policies are subject to regular review and regular conversations and discussions about does this still serve us or not. That's what keeps them fresh. It's what makes sure that people know what they actually say. If it's just written once and shoved in a filing cabinet, it's a really dangerous policy because people forget what it's even about. Contracts should be negotiated. When engineering doesn't participate in the contract process, what seems to happen all the time is that they get signed by security or legal, and they're just like, well, whatever sounds the safest, we'll agree to that. And that's not, number one, sounds the safest. I feel like engineering really needs to be a powerful voice for the other needs of the business, right? The needs of the business to be safe and secure, absolutely, but they exist in tandem and in tension with the need of the business to move swiftly, move with confidence. Just being looped into the conversation process of signing contracts can be a real game changer, because even if you're not showing up all the time and being like, I don't like this, like it reminds them that you have a real vested interest in the language that they're choosing. And it really matters that they get to learn, that they become familiar with what's going to cut your ability to what's going to make it twice as long for you to ship everything? What's going to make it so that, you grind to a halt? And what's okay? Let's see. Also, frameworks can actually be used to achieve compliance with regulations, which is a nice little twofer sometimes. And I want to be super clear that compliance standards exist for a reason. I think sometimes the sheer idiocy of the way we see them implemented makes us kind of cynical about them, and we're like, it's just, it's just red tape. It's not, it just holds us back. They're actually really there for a reason. I remember when I started running systems, and you just slap up port 25 and start sending email across the internet. It was an innocent time. It's not the world that we live in anymore, and that's okay. You never want to be you don't want to be the slowest one being chased by the bear. The problem, though, is that elaborate security theater makes us slower and less competitive, while actually making us less secure, as I'm sure everyone here is aware. So if there's rule number one in this, it's always honor the spirit of the control. And what we bring as engineers is not necessarily the official best. We don't necessarily know what's best, but we are the ones who best know how to implement this in ways that are actually secure while respecting these various tensions. This is a little summary of Jez Humble's talk. He is we can't have continuous delivery because we're regulated, we're not building websites, we have too much legacy, our people are too stupid. Actual reasons, our culture sucks, our architecture sucks. We haven't tried, we don't care enough. I like that. People give all kinds of reasons why they can't follow good modern development best practices, but the one that I most often hear is just cargo culting. They've heard this from someone who heard it from a security person, who heard it from an auditor, who heard it from, and we just accept it. Engineers sometimes will use any excuse not to talk to other people. But this is a solved problem. Like, this was a solved problem a decade ago. How do I know this? Because so many other companies subject to the exact same regulations as you are doing it. A small sample, an even larger sample. I'm just going to go through these really quickly, but I've been collecting slide by slide examples of companies that manage to do like continuous deployment, that have testing in production. If you are one of these companies, please email me the name of your company and a few bullet points. I would love to add you to this list. I have an even longer set of slides where I'm collecting all of them. But we've got Etsy, Honeycomb, Branch Insurance, Stitch, Entrada, Ocado, Clarity, Bank West of Perth, Cabify, Ping Identity. So companies are all over the fucking maps, all over the map when it comes to what they do. So stop blaming regulations and frameworks. It's not actually their fault. This is actually about how we decide to interpret these standards. Something that I think, because engineers tend to be so literal, I think that we sometimes take these terms and we translate them into the most literal thing ever. But like, these are not engineering terms. These are legal terms. They're all subject to interpretation. Even more importantly, most of them come from accounting. So when you think about, like, one of the most common things that I used to hear was when engineers were like, well, I can't deploy my own code to production because, I don't even remember the name for this, one of you probably knows, there's a not the two-body problem, but like you can't have the same person write the code and deploy the code. And you're like, what? Doesn't make, what was it?
Separation of duties.
Thank you, separation of duties, two-person rule. Well, this totally makes sense though if you think about it coming from accounting, where you can't have the same person submit the receipt and approve the receipt. So that makes sense, right? So we can adapt these very sensibly to engineering practices by doing things like, having someone add a comment that they reviewed it when they're submitting their pull request. It really, every situation is unique, and this is why, like, I understand why people cargo cult sometimes, because it can be challenging to think through what your actual risk factors are and what your actual needs are, but at the end of the day, this is why we get paid a lot of money. We do have to understand things sometimes. What bothers me more than that is the fact that we are so freaking bad about sharing the solutions that we do find. Like, the fact that we pass around all of these cargo-culted things about, ooh, we can't do this, we can't do that, but we don't pass around things like, oh no, you totally can do this. And here's how it's appropriate for a company at our stage with our risk factors. Let's start with architecture. The biggest architectural obstacle to continuous delivery is when you want to ship a single line of code, but you have to deploy the whole world. So can you deploy the service you're working on without having to deploy all the dependencies? Can you test the service you're working on without needing an integrated environment? Ultimately, like, engineers shouldn't have to be sitting around thinking about security things all day long. That would completely, you're right, it would slow everything down, it would gum up the works, and it would distract people from their actual daily jobs. So much of this needs to get baked in at the architecture stage. And ideally, you should barely have to think about it after that, because it should happen automatically, right? If you are investing heavily in your test suite, if you invest in your CI/CD pipeline, like, it's so much better to have these layers of checksums and tooling to like automatically validate that, you know, that your packages have been signed and all this stuff. Like, don't bring security in on day 5 or month 5 when you're ready to ship it. Like, bring them in on day 1 so that they can help you bake it into the architecture. Engineering, yeah. In general, engineers shouldn't have to be thinking about this all the time. But you know what we do have to think about all the time, especially senior ICs and managers? Engineering performance and productivity and efficiency, because productivity is fought for or lost in dribs and drabs. You go from a 1-hour cycle time, it slips a few minutes every day or every week, and suddenly it's 6 hours without making any big decisions, just kind of letting things drift. Like, if there's one thing that takes constant vigilance, it's protecting people's time and their ability to focus. And all of those cycles that we're spending on security stuff would be much better devoted to that. When I'm thinking about, you know, senior leadership, and I don't just mean managers and directors and VPs. I think this is a responsibility of every Staff Plus engineer. If you want engineering excellence in a modern team, you have to engage with your security and your legal teams as partners, as equals. They might not be used to thinking of you as a partner and an equal, but it's your job to go make friends with them, take them out for coffee, woo them with treats, do whatever it takes to show that you are on their side, you want to help, you understand that their job is really shitty and hard too, and you can help. You're not just there to ask for things, right? You're also there to make their lives better. I feel like, you know, every team is different. Every product is different. You know, these systems are insanely complex. And it can be really hard to know where to start or which of the, like, just the mountain of things to care about, the things that are alerting you and emailing you and, like, you know, filling up, and like, it's hard sometimes to like figure out what is noise and what is signal. But I feel like if there's one place I would start as an engineering leader on a team where I'm trying to help people get out from underwater, reclaim more of their time, do a better job, it's those feedback loops at the very top. Those feedback loops like, you know, turnaround time for code reviews, turnaround time for deploys, turnaround time for rollbacks, how long the deploy itself takes, how many changes get shipped out at once. You know, there's a huge like life-changing difference between a 15-minute cycle and a 5-hour cycle. And it's not something you can this is not just a battle you can fight once or twice and then move on. It does take vigilance. You know, companies that figure out how to work this way, how to keep people moving quickly, I feel like sometimes we have this reaction to that, like, oh, it means they're being like slave drivers. They're just working us constantly, which is why I really hate the word sprint. Oh, sprint. It's fucking exhausting. I don't want to fucking sprint. Sorry. But that's not it, right? It's actually, I feel like it's making better use of people's time. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. And I feel like we so easily get into this like doom loop of software development where everything's getting, I mean, obviously we exist in a state of entropy, everything's getting a little bit worse all the time, which is fine, that's normal, right? But like, it creeps up on you. Like, the diffs get a little bit bigger, so the code review turnaround takes a little bit longer. So, you know, so it takes longer to deploy, so more changes start getting batched up. So Now you need to hire some specialists. You need to have a team that's devoted to deploys, to tooling. You need some more SRE. Like, the more time it takes, the more time everyone spends waiting on each other and dealing with like the ripple effects of the work that gets created in the process of trying to do the work. Everything just gets slower and slower, and there's no reason for that. I have this back of the envelope calculation that I absolutely confess I have pulled out of my ass, but I also think it's true, which is that, all right, say you've got X number of engineers, and it takes you 15 minutes to deploy end-to-end. Cool. If it takes you about an hour or two, it will take you twice as many people. If it takes you a day to build and deploy, it will take you twice as many more. If it takes you a week, twice as many more, and a month, twice as many more. This is going like that. And if anything, I am underestimating it. You ever like see a company and you're like, oh, cool app. They have 850 engineers? What are they doing with all of them? You know, they're all sitting around waiting on each other to get stuff done or doing. I was talking to this guy at Google, and he had this great quote, and I can't quote him by name, but I will never forget the quote. He's like, every project has a denominator. I was like, what does that mean? He's like, well, you know, if I give you 10,000 people, you better do something great. But if you can do something great with 10 people, you're amazing. And I was just like, that is so true. And I feel like we really are bad at like having the words for leaders that are amazing at doing things, you know, in a lean way. But those are the people that I really admire. Where was it? I got off on a tangent. I apologize. Fast cycle time is an enormous competitive advantage. I really think this is worth fighting for. The happiness of users and the engineers who build the product tends to more or less rise and fall in tandem in my experience. A bit of a lag time, maybe. But you don't tend to see a company whose engineers are miserable and their users are happy, or vice versa. We can't do this because of regulations. Not usually true. We are interpreters between security, legal, and tech. We are not transcriptionists. We are the experts in what we do. We are the experts in software development. We are the experts in socio-technical systems that deliver amazing products. And that means that we need to become the experts in security and legal, and as it overlaps with development. There's no law or regulatory framework preventing us from following all of these best practices. There are sometimes contractual obligations, but businesses want to get paid, so they accept more restrictive controls. This is just a socio-technical process that we need to participate in. This is not about getting out of having to deal with regulations. This is not about bypassing them. Like, we all want better security, not worse security. Here's a really boring example from Honeycomb. We used to manage all of the AWS IAM roles for production using Terraform. So whenever we onboarded or offboarded an engineer, we needed to go remember to manually update a Terraform config file. Sometimes we'd forget. So we switched to a SAML-based flow that hooked into our Google account, which drastically improved how quickly we could disable access for offboarded employees, but the auditors hated it because we could no longer print out a config file listing all of the names with AWS access. Instead, we had to make printouts of the SAML config code and a screenshot of the Google UI to show you who had access. The auditors accepted it eventually, but it was kind of one of those weird cases where us making things more secure felt less secure to them because it was less accessible to some manual auditing process involving PDFs of config files. And I think eventually we added back some sort of scripted way to print out the list of who had access, and they were delighted by that, even though they had no idea how the list was generated. Auditors are on our side too. This is the thing. Like, I know a lot of us have had very spotty experiences with auditors, but I feel like it's really a core part of our mission that we need to accept is to train the auditors and to not be dicks to them, because I guarantee you they have had a lot of engineers being dicks to them. Looking down their noses, rolling their eyes. It's not fun to be on the receiving end of that. It does not make you inclined to think favorably of them or their opinions or their creative solutions for security problems. But there are really good ones out there. And I've never talked to an auditor who didn't fully acknowledge that they learn everything they know from, basically everything they know from the engineers that they get to deal with. Documentation is a huge part of what matters. So, like, if in doubt, at least document what you're going to do up front, do what you say you're going to do, document that you did it. It creates a sense of trust in the process. How to drive change in your org. First, you have to start by building relationships. You have to get to know the people, your counterparts in other divisions. Understand the constraints that they're working under, many of which probably seem as senseless to them as they do to you. Nevertheless, they're being held responsible for it, and probably a lot of other things that you don't know or want to know anything about. But if you can show up and develop some empathy for them, show that you understand their pain, and do something to help them before you start making your requests, I think it goes a long way. This is a long game. I'm never going to pretend that it isn't. But what do we have in security if not time? Sorry, that was mean. This will take time, possibly years. Calcified organizations, and I always hate it when I have to say this, but you won't make a lot of progress without some cover from the top. It's true, which is why people will often say, where do I start? My leadership, they're not engineers, they don't really understand the whole move fast and that's safer. And every time I say, read Accelerate. Get anyone you can to read Accelerate, because otherwise it's just a bunch of us blowhards up here saying a bunch of things. They did research. They did research. I feel like if there's a universal language, it's money, and the second universal language is actual research. Start small. Look for ways to demonstrate what you're talking about. Look for wins. The wins compound over time, just like the pain does. Oh, and P.S., learn this phrase. Compensating controls. AKA, I'm not actually doing what the law says, but I have this other system that proves that I understand the point of the law, and I'm doing it better. Again, the attitude that you show up with this can make a big difference, speaking from experience. Instrument for observability, engineers shouldn't need full production access. This is somewhere where modern observability tooling is really a twofer, because nobody should need to SSH into their servers anymore. You should be able to instrument, look at your instrumentation through a nice little tool like Honeycomb. All you need is commit access and observability, which is what gives us the confidence to move swiftly with confidence. We use SLOs to check multiple boxes here. Executive visibility into important numbers, monitoring, alerts. Instead of needing different systems for each one of these things, SLOs cover them all. So ultimately, I'm making a big pitch here for engineering effectiveness, cross-functional relationships, security, blah, blah, blah. But it isn't just about the security or economic arguments, how well your team performs. Best practices are in the service of team performance. Your team's performance is defined by your socio-technical systems, their health, their agility, their creativity, and especially by the speed of your feedback loops. High-performing teams, in my mind, are the ones that get to spend most of their time solving interesting new problems that move the business materially forward. And everybody wants to be on teams like these. Software engineering has the potential to be a creative, exciting, fulfilling career. We get to solve puzzles for money, like an absurd amount of money. This is the only growth industry of my lifetime. I feel so incredibly lucky to be here. And I would feel that way even if I was like toiling for 12 hours a day of toil and crap, because I grew up on a fucking farm. And I grew up in a farm with dirt under my fingernails, and this is way better than that. Anytime someone on Twitter is like, boy, doesn't computers just make you want to go run a goat farm? I'm like, no. You've never been on a goat farm, have you? It is awful. But 12 hours of toil and crap is not necessary either. We have the power to make this an exciting, creative, fulfilling career and to lift others up after us and get paid a ton of money. It's amazing. This is a quality of life issue, ultimately. This is an ethical issue. Like, building high-performing teams is not just about, scratching our egos. It's about creating a life that feels worth living for each other. So I will close with the exact same slide, my very favorite one, as I did this morning, which is, are we too busy to improve? The end.